Somewhere in a cave in northern Iraq, more than 45,000 years ago, a man died in his late 40s or 50s. That doesn't sound remarkable until you know what his body looked like. His right arm had been amputated near the elbow, he was blind in one eye from a skull fracture, and he had a degenerative disease that made moving painful. And this was a Neanderthal, surviving for decades after injuries that would have made him functionally unable to hunt or climb. So how does someone like that live to almost 50 in a world with no doctors, no wheelchairs, no safety net of any kind? The answer is going to wreck the image you probably have of ancient life. Let's get the popular myth out of the way first, the idea that ancient societies were brutally efficient about disability, that anyone who couldn't pull their weight was left to die. That story is mostly wrong, in a way that says more about the last few centuries than it does about actual prehistory. Back to that Neanderthal. He's known as Shanidar I, named after the cave in Iraqi Kurdistan where his remains were found in 1957. He would have needed serious, sustained help just to function. He couldn't have hunted effectively with one working arm, and he likely couldn't see threats from his blind side. Yet he lived for years after these injuries occurred. Someone was bringing him food. Someone included him in the group instead of leaving him behind. Researchers have found similar patterns across multiple Neanderthal remains, individuals surviving well past the point where solo survival would have been possible. Scientists now study this as the bioarchaeology of care, figuring out how much support a body needed, and by extension, how much support it must have gotten. Go forward to a burial site called Man Bac in what's now northern Vietnam, about 4,000 years old. Most skeletons there are laid out straight, the standard position, but one, called Burial 9, is curled in a fetal position. His bones show a congenital condition that paralyzed him from the waist down since childhood, in a farming community with no modern medicine. His bones show no malnutrition and no pressure sores from neglect. Someone was turning him, feeding him, keeping him clean for years. Go further back, to a cave called Kafze in what's now Israel, roughly 100,000 years old. Buried there is a child with a skull fracture severe enough to cause brain damage, found with deer antlers deliberately placed across the chest. Whoever buried that child sourced specific ritual objects for a kid who, by any cold calculation, wasn't going to contribute much. That's grief with intention behind it. Here's the theory gaining traction among anthropologists, and it flips survival of the fittest logic on its head. For most of human history, we survived as groups, not individuals. A group that cares for its weakest members isn't being inefficient. It's built something valuable, a system that can absorb loss without collapsing. Every human is one bad fall or infection away from becoming dependent on others. If a group's default is abandonment, everyone is living one accident away from being left behind themselves. If the default is care, everyone gets a kind of insurance policy. That's a rational survival strategy for a species that depends entirely on cooperation. Now let's jump forward into Egypt, which gives us something the Stone Age evidence can't: names, careers, and actual written philosophy about how disabled people should be treated. Meet Seneb. He lived around 2520 BCE during Egypt's Old Kingdom and had a form of dwarfism called achondroplasia. Seneb didn't just survive, he thrived. He held titles like overseer of dwarfs in the royal palace and priest of the funerary cults of two pharaohs. He owned thousands of cattle, married a high-ranking priestess, and had children. When he died, he was buried in an elaborate tomb at Giza, close to the pyramids themselves. His tomb statue is one of the most famous pieces of Old Kingdom art, and what's remarkable is how it's composed. Seneb sits cross-legged beside his wife, with their children carved standing in the space below him, where a full-sized man's legs would normally extend. The sculptor didn't hide Seneb's proportions, he built an entirely new composition around them, turning his physical difference into the centerpiece of a family monument. Seneb wasn't a singular exception either. Egyptologists have identified over 200 documented cases of dwarfism in ancient Egyptian records, with individuals working as respected goldsmiths, jewelers, dancers, and court officials. Two Egyptian gods, Bes and Ptah, were depicted with the physical traits of dwarfism, linked to protection and craftsmanship. A New Kingdom moral text even instructed that caring for the elderly, sick, and, in its words, the malformed, was a basic duty of a decent person. That's a 4,000-year-old text saying how you treat vulnerable people is a measure of your own character. Now for the dark part, because pretending ancient history was an unbroken utopia would be its own kind of dishonesty. You've probably heard the story about ancient Sparta, newborns inspected by a council of elders, and if judged weak or deformed, carried off to a ravine to die. This comes from the biographer Plutarch, and for almost 2,000 years it's been treated as fact. It's the exact example Adolf Hitler cited in a 1929 speech praising Sparta as, in his words, the purest racial state in history. Here's the problem. When historians actually looked for evidence, they came up empty. Plutarch was writing 700 years after the events, and he wasn't writing careful history. He was writing moral legend. No other ancient writer, including philosophers who genuinely held eugenicist views, ever mentions this practice. Archaeologists excavated the ravine in question and found only the bones of adult men, likely executed criminals, not infants. One Spartan king, Agesilaus II, had a physical disability from birth and still became one of the most powerful men in the city. So where does that leave us? Ancient societies weren't free of prejudice, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. Attitudes varied by culture, era, and whether a disability was visible from birth or earned later in a respected context like war. But what the evidence actually supports, once you strip away 2 millennia of people using one unverified anecdote to justify their own ideas about human worth, is something messier and more human. Most ancient communities, from Neanderthal cave shelters to Bronze Age Vietnam, to Old Kingdom Egypt, to classical Greece, put real effort into keeping their vulnerable members alive, integrated, and sometimes genuinely honored. That has a direct implication for the myth of the brutal, disability-hostile ancient world. It isn't really an accurate memory of the deep past. It's a story amplified much later, during periods obsessed with strength and social Darwinism that needed ancient history to validate their own harsher instincts. We didn't inherit cruelty toward disability from prehistory. We invented a convenient story about prehistory to excuse cruelty we were already choosing more recently. Which brings us back to that man in Shanidar Cave, missing an arm, blind in one eye, somehow alive for decades in one of the harshest environments a human has ever tried to survive. He's one of the oldest documented examples of disability in the human story. The fact that we know about him at all is proof that somebody, with no writing and no medicine, decided keeping him alive mattered. Not because he could hunt, just because he was theirs. And a continent away, thousands of years later, an Egyptian court decided a man with dwarfism was worth carving into eternity beside his own family. So next time someone says ancient people were harsher about human worth than we are today, you can push back on that. What the record actually supports is more hopeful. Caring for people who can't care for themselves isn't a modern invention. It might be one of the oldest things we know how to do, and one of the things that made us human in the first place.